All right. Well, today we're starting a brand new series. If you haven't been here before, my name's Lou. I'm one of the pastors here. I'm glad that you're with us. And you've picked a great week to be here for the first time because we're starting a brand new teaching segment. We call that a series. And so here's how we'll kick things off. So I heard about this study. I've actually mentioned it here before. It's a study. It's been going on for 85 years. Like one project going on for 85 years. Can you imagine doing like one homework assignment for 85 years? So it's been going on over at Harvard. So, you know, they're doing it over there. A lot of smart people over there. And what they're trying to figure out is what makes people happy. Like, how do people measure their quality of life? What are the factors that determine whether or not someone is satisfied with their life, especially toward the end of their lives? Like, what common thread passes through all of the lives that are like thriving? And what they found, obviously it's a lot of different things, but what they found was that the most influential factor by far when it comes to the way that somebody measures their overall life satisfaction, the thing that makes the biggest difference is the quality of their relationships. The quality of their relationships. Which sounds amazing, right? Kind of sounds like really, if it's that easy, you know, it's not like all the money you make, it's not where you live, it's not even like health, it's relationships. The problem with that is that most relationships are made up of people, you know? And people are complicated. So recently I tried to do a Rubik's Cube. And when I say tried, I mean I spent hours. Like, I was trying to figure it out. And I did it. And by did it, I mean I watched a YouTube video and it walked me through how to do the whole thing. But they're hard. Rubik's Cubes are hard. Like, you think you got the greens lined up and like you move one and it's all out of whack. Your oranges are all over the place. Your whites are everywhere. Like, it's like you move one, so many other things are affected. And for me, I don't know, but that kind of feels like people sometimes, you know? Like, people are complicated. Things are messy. Like, sometimes getting a relationship right feels like trying to untangle spaghetti, you know? It's just really messy and really complicated. Let me ask you this, have you ever tried so hard, like put so much time and attention into a person or a relationship only to be accused of not trying? You ever been there? Or like, have you ever been really, really like deeply offended? You know, like slighted. And then finally something happens, you have the conversation with someone, you're like, hey, you know, like this is how that hit me. And they're shocked, you know, like they're just blown away. And it's like, really? Are we on the same planet? Or maybe you've been on the other end of that, you know, like you think things are A-okay. All of a sudden someone comes up to you and is like, hey, I have been like ruminating over this for weeks. And you're like, what? Like, I don't even see the problem with that, you know? Like, people are really, really hard. Have you ever been in a relationship where you feel like you're carrying the load of the whole relationship? Like, you're doing the work in the relationship? And then somehow or another, you find out the other side of the relationship also feels like they're carrying the whole load of the relationship, right? People are complicated. It's messy. Relationships are messy, but people matter. And so the health of our relationships is worth it. Over the next few weeks, what we're going to do is look at some relationship principles. Now, these principles are pretty broad principles. I would argue that they apply to just about all of our relationships, but like any broad principle, there are some exceptions, right? And no example is going to be the perfect example, but my hope is that by the end of this series, if we take this stuff seriously, we'll have some like clarity in the fog. You know, we'll have a lighthouse to shoot for. Not that everything's going to be perfect, not that we're going to have all the issues sorted out, but that some main clear principles can point us in the right direction. And while we're going to be looking at the teachings of Jesus and his followers here, the great thing about these principles is that they work. They apply to everyone, no matter where you are with your own personal faith or how you feel about Jesus. In fact, seeing how effective some of these are might actually pull you in the direction of maybe being open to considering believing in who Jesus was and the things that he said. So here's the visual, okay? Now, I didn't make this up. I'm not that smart. I wish I was. But this is a visual, and for the sake of today, the language that I'm going to be using is primarily about romantic relationships. But these principles, they apply to all of our relationships. They apply to work relationships, family relationships, friendships. But for the sake of today and for the sake of clarity, I'm going to be using language that's romantic relationship based, okay? So here's how it goes. And again, this is not perfect, but we're just trying to get some clarity here. When you and I begin a relationship, actually way before a relationship starts, we have very simply desires, right? We have some hopes and dreams for our relationships. These desires, these are things that I want in someone, somewhere, someday. And these desires, they're not right or wrong. They're just what they are. And I may have gotten them from watching my parents. I may have gotten them from watching TV. I may have gotten them from a lot of different places, but they're just what I hope to find in someone someday, right? Now, I'm married, but let's pretend like I'm younger and I'm just pretending, right? Someone someday out there. And so, again, it's not right or wrong, just is the way it is. So let's say, for you, let's say you're growing up and you're like, man, my mom cooked every single night, and this is a oven mitt, not a puppet. And maybe you're like, man, I want to find someone who just really wants to cook, and cook for the family, and how amazing would that be? Or maybe you're like, I want to find someone who's going to let me cook for them because I love that, and that's how I want to show them that I love them, and oh, man, wouldn't that be nice? And we want someone, maybe you want someone who's going to sweep you off your feet, someone who's going to be super romantic all the time, and isn't that going to be great? And maybe you want someone who is going to help you take care of a home, right? Like someone who's going to clean. Or maybe you're the person, you're like, one day I'm going to find someone who's going to let me clean. I don't get you if that's your story. But they're hopes and dreams, right? And they're all over the place in every area of life. Maybe you've got desires for your faith with that person. I want to meet somebody that's going to help me raise children with a faith of their own, right? Or maybe not. Maybe it's the other direction, but it's a desire. Maybe you want to be with someone who's going to start a family with you, and maybe you hope they're going to want to have tons and tons and tons of kids, and that's your thing. Or maybe there's a certain way you hope to be able to raise your kids. Maybe you want to travel together, and it's going to be amazing when you get to do that, and so you've got hopes and dreams. Or maybe you grew up and you watch your parents talk to each other all the time, and the response rate via text was 1 second. They've never made each other wait to respond for text. And man, I want that too. Or maybe it's not a romantic relationship. Maybe it's just a friendship, right? And you've got desires for what your best friend and your closest friend's going to look like, and your dad spent his birthday every single year fishing with his best friend. You're like, that's what I'm going to find one day in a best friend. And so we're going to spend birthdays together. But all that to say, in our relationships, we have desires. And when it's a romantic relationship specifically, we're like, all right, here we go. And we hit the road, and we start checking people out, right? And seeing nope, not you, or maybe thought so. And you hope to find someone who's aligned with your desires. And it's great, ideally. But then at some point, there's a shift that happens. Right? You meet that person, you're together, you've got all these desires, they've got their desires, they've got their own box, right? And at some point, there's a shift. And it might be when you get married. That might be when the shift happens, if you get married. It might be when you define the relationship. You have the DTR conversation, all of a sudden you're official. When I was growing up, you changed your Facebook status. Now we're FBO, Facebook official. Anybody? Or if you want to go way back, you put their name on your AOL profile, with the little less than 3, right? And then the name. Okay. But at some point, often things shift. Maybe it's because you come to a certain age. Maybe it's in a relationship with your parents. Like at this age, there's a shift, something changes. And here's where we're introduced to the other thing that the shift causes. We call them expectations, right? And often what happens is that what started as a desire becomes an expectation. And the issue with that is that expectations feel different than desires. And unfulfilled desires feel very different from unmet expectations, right? So I'll give you a little basketball example, which is a surprise, I'm sure, right? If you don't know this, whenever there are people playing basketball at a court that's open, let's say it's not a game, there's just people and balls are going toward the rim, right? If you miss and there's someone else on the court and they pick up the ball, it's fair game. They can shoot the ball. Doesn't matter if it's yours or not. You just get to shoot. It's like, we're all on the court, we're all shooting. But if you make the shot, it doesn't matter whose ball it is, you get it back. It's called courtesy. It's like respect. It's like basketball 101, you make a shot, you give back the person who shot it, right? Just how it works, right? Yeah. So my son, we got a little basketball hoop in the house. We actually have a few in the house. And we play ball in the house. He'll just like be outside his room, like playing on his little thing. And every once in a while, he'll look at me and he'll just like throw me the ball. And I love that. I love that because I'm like, oh, I always want to shoot a basketball if there's a hoop around. So I'm like, oh, great, Logan, and I like take a shot. And every once in a blue moon, the shot goes in, right? But with my son, especially right now, where he is, the age he is, he'll catch the ball after it goes in and be like, nice. And then he'll just like run away. And I'm looking at him like, hey, hello, like, whoa, I made the shot. And he's looking at me like, okay. And I'm like, give me the ball back. Who raised you, child? Like, this is what you do. This is what you, and he's like, okay, and he gives it to me. Now, look, there's the difference between an unfulfilled desire and an unmet expectation, right? He can choose to give me the ball the first time, whether he wants to or not. I'm not expecting it. And so when he does, I'm like, ooh, delight. But if he doesn't, I'm just continuing on my way, right? However, the moment I make it, there's now an expectation that that's supposed to be mine. And now I feel like there's this grave injustice if he walks away and takes a shot before I do. It's like, give me what's supposed to be mine, right? And so what I desire from someone somewhere can quickly, in a relationship, become what I expect of you. And that feels different, right? We go from like, I hope one day someone's gonna wanna cook for me to like, we're doing DoorDash again? Or I hope one day we're gonna have a home to take care of. Someone's gonna help me take care of the home. And it's like, oh, so are we ever gonna get around to like wiping down the bathroom? I wanna find someone who's romantic to like, we just don't do anything anymore. It's not what it used to be. We wanna have kids together, but like, what do you mean you want to focus on your career? That's not what you're supposed to do. What do you mean, like, you don't want our kids to go to church on Sunday? What do you mean it's okay if they stay home? And even outside of a romantic relationship, it's like, whoa. Like, you're going to be out of town for my birthday? Like, no. Internally, this was a desire. It became an expectation. Like, this is just what I grew up expecting. Like, you spend your birthday with your best friend, right? And what I was hoping for from someone someday becomes what I expect of you, what you're supposed to do. Now, don't get me wrong. This is not a perfect visual, right? And right away, if you're like me, you're thinking critically, and you're like, okay, there's a lot of exceptions to this, and I would agree with you. There are some exceptions to this, but there are also realities to expectations. Like one reality of expectation is the more expectations you have, the less gratitude there is. Expectations just push out gratitude, no matter the size of the investment in one another. A great example of this is a mortgage. If you have a mortgage, there's an organization, there's an institution that gave you a ton of money to be able to have your own home. A ton. And you're also giving them a ton of money, not just paying them back, but paying them interest, and a lot of it over the course of a long time. That's huge investment from both sides. And I don't know about you, like, my lender doesn't give me the warm and fuzzies ever. Right? Like, we don't feel feelings of gratitude. It's just a compromise. There's expectations on both sides. You do your part, I'll do my part. But when someone doesn't, then very quickly we find ourselves in a debt-debtor relationship. There's a feeling like, the feeling is, and while we often wouldn't say this, the feeling is, you owe me. You owe me. And while we might not say, like, you owe me dinner tonight, like, have you ever felt like you deserved an apology, right? Or like, and that's the language we use, like, I owe you an apology, let me make it up to you. We use the language of debt-debtor relationship. There's something that was supposed to happen that didn't happen. There's an expectation that wasn't met. And so gratitude is pushed out. And the sad thing about expectations is you really can't win. You can't win. You can only not lose. You know, it's like, oh, great, you finally got around to taking out the garbage. You hit the mark. You didn't fail. Congrats. You know, okay, good. We finally are spending some quality time together. Great. Right? Like, there's just no room when you just meet the mark. And so it's heavy. It's exhausting. It's not fun. There aren't feelings of closeness and intimacy and gratitude. When you push out gratitude, you also begin to push out joy. It's a struggle. And so the question is, like, where does that leave us? Like, what are the options? You know? I don't know about you, but if you're like me and I'm sitting in your seat, I'm sitting there looking next to me thinking, like, man, I'm so glad she's hearing this right now. I think a little. And the reason why is because we all know what it's like to be on the receiving end of someone else's expectations. Right? We all know the weight. We all know the work that it feels like. I just gotta not get them upset. I gotta not just try to do the right thing. We all know what it feels like to not be able to win, to feel unappreciated. We all know that. And so that feeling sticks with us because it's painful. It's not so easy, though, to know what it feels like to have a lot of expectations for someone else. But you know how you know? Let me ask you this. Like, have you ever been frustrated with, annoyed by, fed up, let down, disappointed, offended? Ever felt those feelings? Those are the feelings of unmet expectations. Now again, let me qualify this, I'm not saying it's bad to have expectations. What I am saying is that where there are expectations, there won't be gratitude. You know, I have an expectation, Allie and I have an expectation that she is not going to poison me when she serves me dinner. That's an expectation. But you know what? There's also, because that's an expectation, there's never been a moment, if someone's like, hey, tell me about something you love about your relationship. I'm never like, you know, I just love that when I sit down to eat, I'm not thinking like, this might be my last meal. Because where there's an expectation, there won't be a sense of gratitude. It's just how we work. So what often happens is the solution is compromise, right? 50-50. Like, you do some of my stuff, I'll do some of your stuff, and hopefully there's enough of each of us getting our stuff where we're both happy enough, right? And so we compromise. And so what we have to do to compromise, well, then with one another, we've got to negotiate, we've got to compromise, And then we got to keep track of one another. Right? Have you ever had that conversation? Well, come on, I just did this and that. And remember yesterday you asked me to do, and then I did? Remember? Yeah, so how about, right? Like, I'm watching how many of my expectations you're meeting because there's some that I want to make sure. And we got to make sure this is 50-50. And that's one way to do it. But there's another way to do it that was taught by Jesus and his followers. The Apostle Paul broke down in detail. But it's not so exciting. It's a foundational principle of relationships. He wrote it to a church that was split, a church that was divided and dividing. And he got real broad, and then he zoomed in to people in their own homes and talked about how they could deal with one another. And he presented this idea, all right, get ready. Here's what he says to do with one another, okay? There's a verb, strong word. He says, submit. Yeah. So right now, it's very hard to find a Hallmark card that says anything about submission. Right? There are no songs about submission. Nobody loves that. That's not like warm and fuzzy. Submit implies like rank. Like when you submit to someone, you put their expectations and desires above yours. In fact, we can even say, just for the sake of this visual, again, this is imperfect. When I submit to someone, I take my expectations and I put them back in the desires box. You don't have expectations of somebody that you submit to. And you put them above yourself. Like completely. Which is not very exciting. But he's not done. It's not just one word. It's a whole idea. Here's what he said next. He says, submit to one another. Now, if you know this verse, you probably knew that that's what he was going to say next, right? And it's just like, yeah, of course, it makes sense that maybe you're used to hearing that, submit to one another. But this is not a normal setup of these words. Like I just said, the idea of submission implies rank. It's like one before the other. So him saying, submit to one another, it's this like cycle of submission. It's a race to the back of the line. He's saying both of you put the other completely before yourself. In other words, now here's where it gets interesting and maybe a little more attractive. You could tell Hallmark about this. It's not 50-50, it's 100. Like, I am completely in this for you, and you're completely in this for me. It's a picture of complete sacrifice, and that's scary. Like, that requires a level of vulnerability, right? You ever see two people, like, playing tug of war, and then, like, one person drops the rope? Right? It's like you got to do it at the same time because like what if they drop it before me, or like getting off a seesaw, you know? Like it feels like one of us is going to get nailed here because it's vulnerability, but that's how we build trust. And you can't have intimacy without trust. And so it starts with being vulnerable and putting the other one first. It's a race to the back of the line. We call this mutual submission. It's you first. And it's scary, but really this is what we were wired for. I heard a story, actually this week, heard it for the first time. Apparently it's a pretty popular story. It's called The Gift of the Magi. And it's a story about a couple who just got married. They don't have much money. And for Christmas one year, they buy each other gifts. Now, I forget what her name is, but the wife, she had this long, beautiful hair, and she loved it so much. And the husband had this watch that he loved so much. And for Christmas, he decided he was going to sell his watch to buy her combs for her hair. And at the same time, she decided she was going to cut her hair to buy him a chain for his watch. And so Christmas morning shows up, and he's got a chain but no watch, and she's got combs, but she doesn't have her long hair anymore. And, if you look at that from a distance, look at just the fact, it's like, oh, how tragic. But nobody reads that and thinks tragedy. Like, it's a beautiful picture of mutual submission. of sacrifice, of saying like, you're more important to me than that thing. Like we all want to know he'd give up his watch for us, that she cut her hair for us. Right? Like, it's so much more exciting. Think about this. Like, for Christmas, let's say you and your significant other, if you have one, you're like, okay, we're both going to spend $50 on each other. You know what? Just go buy yourself something for $50, and I'll go buy myself something for $50. Maybe you've done that before. I have. But it's not very, like, you know? Because we were made to, like, live in community, connection, with one another, to meet each other's needs. And so it's a beautiful picture, the idea of one person giving everything while the other person is giving everything. It's a picture of submission. I heard one person say that happy couples live as if they owe each other everything, but they expect nothing in return. It's giving with no expectations. And even if you want to take this out of romantic relationships, I would argue that probably the friends you feel closest with probably are the ones that you don't feel like you're always afraid you're going to annoy, right? Like they're not expecting a ton from you. It doesn't mean that you're not close. It doesn't mean you don't spend time together. It just means they're probably pretty difficult to let down. They're just there. They get you. They understand, right? It's a beautiful picture when people give with no expectation of receiving something back. So for me, like I need a way, how am I supposed to feel then, right? Like what does it feel like to actually like do something and not expect something back in return? Like what's got to be going on internally? I heard a little story not too long ago. It was about a king, and it's not a real story. I've been kind of changing it a little bit to make it work. Okay, so there's this king, super generous king. He's got a ton of land. And so he gives all of his land to his townspeople, or a lot of his land to his townspeople. He's like, here, enjoy, flourish, right? Do stuff with the land. And so there's a guy in the town who decides he's going to grow crops, and he grows carrots. And he is so moved by the generosity of the king that he takes his best carrot and he brings it to the king, and he goes, King, this is for you. It's my best carrot. I want you to have this. I'm just so grateful for what you've done. And the king is like, wow, right? Like he didn't have to do that, but he did. And he did it expecting nothing in return. So the king, like so moved by this guy, now moved in return by his generosity. He's like, for your best carrot, I want you to have my best horse. And so the guy goes home with the king's best horse. It's a picture of two people giving generously, expecting nothing in return. But there's another guy in the story, the townsperson, sitting there like watching the whole thing happen. And he goes home and he thinks, man, if that guy can get a horse for a carrot, think about what I could get for a horse. And so he goes home and he gets his best horse and he brings it to the king. And he goes, King, I brought you my best horse. And the king goes, thank you. He doesn't say anything else. And the guy gets like all bent out of shape. Why? Because he's got an expectation. He just saw what happened. Now he's expecting to receive something back. And the king says like very clearly, he says, your neighbor was trying to give me something. He's trying to give something to me. But you were trying to get something from me. And if we're not careful, like we could take that mentality into relationships. Like we do it because it's going to come back. We do it because of how it's going to be returned. And so the idea is like to give with no expectation is to just like give and like let it go. Like to put yourself, like get yourself to the place where you're like, I just want to like clean this because I just want her to come home and see it clean. Like that's it. Not because of anything else. Like I just want to cook this meal just because I want them to come home and like love that there's a hot cooked meal. Like just like let it go. It's a picture of generosity, and that kind of generosity tends to draw people in. It tends to snowball. You start to feel like there's someone in your corner, not someone's expectations that you have to live up to. It's a beautiful picture. Now, Paul continues here, right? And this is important. And it's another curveball. It's a second curveball in this letter. He says, submit to one another out of. Now, you and I, if we're reading this, we would expect him to say, out of love for one another. Submit to one another out of concern for one another. Submit to one another out of care for one another. But he says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Like, what? All of a sudden, there's a third party in this relationship. And this for him was the thing that motivated people to change, right? Like, in other words, this is the whole framework of what we call Christianity or following Jesus. This right here, this principle. If you get nothing else from today, this is the idea of following Jesus. My treatment of you, what I do for you, is not in response to what you've done for me. It's in response to what he has done for me. Your treatment of your significant other is not because they deserve it. It's because he deserves it, right? Like if we're gonna take that silly story with the king, it's like the guy with the carrot going to the king and being like, here, because of what you've given me, I want you to have this carrot. And it's like the king looks at him and says, you wanna say thanks to me? Like the best thing you can do for me is take that carrot home and give it to the people that you love. Like Jesus literally said, look, what you did for them, you did for me. If you want to show your concern, your love for me, your devotion for me, like respond to that by giving it to someone who does not deserve it. And so if you're like submit to one another and the whole idea of like, 100, that's fun. But you know what? I'm going to be honest. It gets old before you get to your car. It's like, wait, like turn off the heat, right? Like it's very quickly, it gets old. Like giving up your way very quickly. If you're doing it out of like love or positive feelings or something you're trying to muster up for them. Because you know who deserves complete submission? No one. But you don't do it because they deserve it. Like you draw strength from a third party outside of it. And that's where you see people do things that don't make sense. Right? When you see someone respond with generosity when they've been shown the exact opposite, you're like, that doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to you. It makes complete sense to them because it's like the king told them, no, like just give it, pass it on. Like they're feeling like they've been given so much, they're just passing it on to somebody else. And this is the framework. This is how it all works. This is what's at the heart of what we call the gospel, the good news about Jesus. We treat others not because they deserve it, but because he does. Not in response to them, but in response to him. And this is the secret. This is the secret to a 100, intimate, trusting relationship filled with gratitude